She noticed the CEO step past her own son without slowing down, not even when his sneaker tapped softly against the metal leg of the waiting room chair. A small sound that seemed to hang longer than it should in the quiet corridor, and Lena Brooks found herself pausing mid-stride, her clipboard angled slightly against her hip as she shifted her weight just enough to keep them in view. The hallway outside the private intensive care unit carried its usual low hum, machines breathing steadily behind closed doors, distant footsteps softened by polished vinyl floors, a cartwheel squeaking once before disappearing around the corner, but something in that moment felt out of rhythm. The boy, maybe 8, sat upright but not stiff, his fingers tracing the edge of a worn backpack resting against his knees, eyes lifted toward the woman who had just walked by him in a tailored charcoal coat, her phone pressed to her ear, her voice low and measured, discussing something that sounded too structured, too composed for this space. She did not look down. She did not reach out. She moved with the same efficiency she would have in a boardroom, her heels striking evenly, her posture unchanged, and Lena found herself taking a slower step, then another, as if her body had decided before her mind that she needed to see what happened next. The boy's gaze followed his mother for a second longer than expected, not with urgency, not with confusion, just a quiet tracking. Then it dropped back to his hands, which stilled for a moment before resuming their slow, repetitive motion along the fabric seam. That was when Lena noticed the man. He stood a few feet away, near the wall where the overhead lights cast a softer, diffused glow, his uniform plain, dark, the kind that blended easily into the background of a place like this. Caleb Hayes did not shift when the CEO passed. He did not step forward or call out. He simply remained where he was, one hand resting loosely near his pocket, the other holding a folded piece of paper that he did not seem to be reading. There was nothing performative about him, nothing that suggested he was trying to insert himself into the moment, and yet he did not. Leave. Lena adjusted her grip on the clipboard, tilting it slightly as she took half a step back toward the nurse's station, her shoulder brushing lightly against the counter edge as she angled herself for a clearer line of sight without appearing to linger. A nurse behind her murmured something about lab results. A printer clicked to life. Fluorescent light reflected faintly off the polished floor, but Lena's attention stayed fixed on the small triangle of space between the boy, the retreating figure of his mother, and the man who remained. The CEO reached the double doors at the end of the corridor and pushed through without breaking her call, the soft hydraulic hinge pulling the door closed behind her with a controlled hush. The boy did not react to the sound. He just sat there, shoulders slightly forward now, his foot making a small, absent tap against the chair leg again. Caleb moved then, but only a fraction. He shifted his stance, stepping just enough to place himself closer to the boy's line of sight, not directly in front, not intrusive, just present in the periphery. He did not speak. He did not gesture. He simply stayed. Lena felt that pause stretch, not long, not dramatic, just long enough to register as something she could not quite file away, and instead of turning back to her chart, she remained there a moment longer than necessary, watching a scene that did not look like much at all, except for the part that did not fit. The next evening, Lena slowed again as she passed the same stretch of hallway, her steps naturally shortening before she reached the row of chairs, as if her body had already memorized where to look. The boy was there in the same spot, backpack resting upright this time, one strap looped carefully over the armrest, his fingers pressing and releasing the zipper tab in a quiet rhythm. The overhead lights hummed faintly, one of them flickering once before settling, casting a brief shift in brightness across the floor. Down the corridor, the double doors opened and Victoria Whitmore stepped out, her phone lowered now, held loosely at her side instead of pressed to her ear. She did not walk past immediately. For a second, she stood, still, just outside the doorway, her gaze angled somewhere ahead, not quite toward the boy, not quite away either. Then she moved, her stride measured, but there was a slight break in it, a fraction of a pause as she passed within arm's reach of him, the kind that could be missed if not watched closely. The boy did not speak. He adjusted his foot, pulling it back from the chair leg this time, leaving the space quiet. Caleb was already there, leaning lightly against the wall, his posture unchanged from the night before, one shoulder angled back, weight evenly distributed, as if he had settled into that exact position without effort. At some point, A small bottle of water appeared on the seat beside the boy, unopened, its plastic catching the overhead light. Lena could not recall seeing it placed there. No one had bent down. No exchange had happened. She shifted slightly closer to the counter, turning a page on her clipboard without looking at it, her attention fixed on the space between them again, noticing how none of them acknowledged the bottle, and how, after a moment, the boy's hand moved toward it, slow, deliberate, as if the timing mattered. By the third night, Lena did not walk past the chairs at all, choosing instead to approach from the far side of the nurse's station, where the reflection from the glass partition gave her a wider angle without drawing attention, her pen resting lightly against the edge of her clipboard as she slowed before she reached the corner. The hallway carried a softer tone at this hour, the earlier rush gone, replaced by the steady cadence of distant monitors and the occasional low murmur from behind partially closed doors, and in that quieter space, the small movements seemed to carry more weight. Noah was there again, but not in the same posture. This time he sat slightly turned, one shoulder angled toward the wall, his backpack placed on the floor beside him instead of on the chair, unzipped just enough to reveal the edge of a notebook. His fingers were not tracing the zipper now. They rested still against his knee, then lifted briefly to adjust the cuff of his sleeve, pulling it down over his wrist before letting it settle. The bottle of water from the night before was gone. In its place, a small pack of crackers sat unopened on the chair beside him, the plastic crinkling faintly when the air vent above shifted direction. Lena could not pinpoint when it had appeared. She had not seen anyone approach. Caleb stood a few feet farther back tonight, not against the wall, but near the base of a column where the light broke differently across his shoulders, casting a softer outline that made him easier to overlook if someone were not already paying attention. His stance had changed just enough to register. One foot set slightly forward, his hands free now, no paper in them, no visible task, but nothing about him suggested waiting for something specific. He glanced once toward the double doors, not turning his head fully, just a slight shift of his eyes, then returned to stillness. Victoria emerged moments later, the doors opening with a controlled sweep before settling back into place behind her. She was not on her phone this time. Her hands were empty, fingers loosely aligned at her sides, and for a brief second she did not move at all, standing just outside the threshold as if adjusting to the light or the space beyond the room. Lena noticed the pause because it did not match the rest of her movement. It held for less than a second. Then Victoria stepped forward, her stride resuming its familiar rhythm. But as she passed Noah, her gaze dipped, not fully, not long enough to meet his, just a slight downward angle that broke the straight line of her usual forward focus. Noah did not look up immediately. He shifted first, pulling his foot back beneath the chair, then lifting his hand to rest on the edge of the seat where the crackers sat. His fingers pressed lightly against the plastic, not opening it, just confirming its presence before his hand withdrew. Caleb moved then, but only enough to adjust his position by a few inches, closing a small gap that had not been obvious until it changed. He did not step closer to Noah directly. Instead, he repositioned himself so that the line between them no longer required Noah to turn his head fully to see him. It was a subtle change, one that could be mistaken for casual movement, but it altered the spacing in a way Lena had not seen before. A nurse passed behind Lena, the soft squeak of rubber soles against the floor briefly pulling her attention away, but when she looked back, the arrangement remained intact. Victoria had already moved past them, nearing the elevator bank at the end of the corridor, her pace unchanged again, her posture returning to its earlier precision. Yet Lena noticed that as she waited for the elevator doors to open, her hand lifted slightly, not to reach for her phone, but to touch the edge of her sleeve near her wrist, pressing the fabric once before letting it fall. The elevator chimed softly, the doors sliding open with a low mechanical hum, and she stepped inside without looking back. The sound of the doors closing carried down the hallway, softer than expected, almost absorbed by the quiet. Noah's hand returned to the crackers, this time lifting the pack just enough to reposition it closer to the center of the seat before setting it down again without opening it. He leaned back slightly, his shoulders easing against the chair, and for a brief moment his gaze shifted sideways, not fully toward Caleb, but in his direction, as if aligning with where Caleb now stood. Caleb did not respond. He remained in place, his posture steady, his presence unchanged, yet the space between them felt different now, not smaller, but more intentional. Lena adjusted her stance, stepping a little closer to the counter, angling her body so she could see both the chair and the column without turning her head too far, her pen tapping once softly against the clipboard before going still. The hallway remained quiet, the background sound steady, but the pattern in front of her had begun to shift in ways she could not quite map, each small detail fitting on its own, yet not aligning with the simple explanation she had first assumed, and instead of moving on, she stayed, watching the arrangement hold just long enough to feel deliberate. By the fourth night, Lena did not pretend to be passing through anymore. She set her clipboard down on the counter with a deliberate softness and shifted her position a few feet to the left, aligning herself with the narrow gap between the column and the waiting chairs where she could track both Noah and the double doors without moving her head, her body angled just enough to make her stillness look like routine. The hallway felt quieter than usual, not empty, but slowed, as if the sounds had stretched out, the distant monitor beeps spaced farther apart, the rolling carts passing with less urgency, and in that extended quiet, the small repetitions began to stand out. Noah was seated as before, but his posture had changed again, his back straighter tonight, both feet planted evenly on the floor, his hands resting flat on his thighs for a moment before one lifted to adjust the position of the unopened crackers, sliding them half an inch closer to the edge of the seat, then stopping, as if that placement mattered. Lena let her gaze hold there longer than necessary, then shifted slightly, leaning one shoulder against the counter to maintain the angle without drawing attention. Caleb stood in nearly the same place as the night before, though not exactly. His weight had shifted to the other leg, the line of his shoulders angled a few degrees differently, enough that the light from the overhead fixture caught the side of his face more clearly when he turned his head just slightly toward the corridor, not toward Noah, not toward the doors, but somewhere in between. He did not look at the boy. He did not move toward him. Yet he remained within the same measured distance, consistent, unbroken. Lena tracked that spacing now, noticing how it never closed fully, never expanded beyond a few feet, as if it were held in place by something she could not see. The double doors opened again, the soft push releasing a brief wash of brighter light from the ICU room before settling back into the corridor's muted tone, and Victoria stepped out with the same controlled movement, though tonight her pace slowed just a fraction earlier than before. She stopped one step short of where she had the previous night, her body angled slightly toward the chairs, her gaze lowering again, not directly, not fully, but enough to break the line of her usual forward focus. Lena watched that moment carefully, her fingers resting still against the edge of the counter, her attention narrowing to the timing of it. Victoria's hand lifted, not to reach out, but to adjust the cuff of her coat, smoothing the fabric once, then again, before her arm lowered. It was a small action, ordinary on its own, but it landed in the space between her and the boy at the same moment his fingers brushed the plastic of the cracker pack again, pressing lightly without opening it. Caleb shifted then, not forward, not closer, but sideways, a subtle reposition that brought him into a clearer line with Noah's peripheral vision, his movement precise enough to register, but quiet enough to pass as incidental. Lena found herself leaning forward slightly, just enough to confirm the alignment, her eyes moving from Noah's hands to Caleb's stance and back again. No one spoke. No one acknowledged the other. Yet the sequence repeated with slight variations, the order holding but the timing adjusting, as if each part responded to something unspoken. A nurse walked past behind Lena, slowing just a fraction as she glanced toward the chairs before continuing on, the faint scent of antiseptic trailing in her wake. The elevator at the end of the hall chimed once, the doors opening and closing without anyone stepping out, the sound lingering longer than expected in the quiet. Victoria resumed her movement then, stepping past Noah with that same near pause, her gaze dipping again, this time a fraction longer, her shoulders tightening briefly before settling as she continued toward the elevator bank. Lena followed her with her eyes for a second, then returned to the space near the chairs, noticing that Noah had shifted again, his hand now resting on the seat beside the crackers, not touching them, just placed there, his body angled slightly toward where Caleb stood. Caleb remained still, his posture unchanged, his presence steady, and yet the arrangement between them felt increasingly structured, not random, not casual, but not easily explained either. Lena straightened slightly, then adjusted her position once more, stepping a few inches to the side to refine her view, her attention fixed on the pattern that kept repeating with just enough variation to resist a simple explanation, each detail fitting on its own, but together forming something she could not yet piece together. And instead of stepping away, she stayed, her gaze anchored to the small, quiet space where nothing obvious was happening, and yet nothing seemed accidental. By the fifth night, Lena arrived earlier than her shift required, setting her bag down beneath the counter and positioning herself at the same angled gap she had used before, but this time she did not pretend to work. She stood with both hands resting lightly on the counter edge, her body still, her attention fixed on the chairs before anything had even begun, as if she were waiting for the pattern to assemble itself again. The hallway carried a slightly different rhythm tonight, a quieter stretch between scheduled rounds, the overhead lights steady, the distant monitors softer, and a few staff members moving more slowly than usual, their footsteps less hurried, their voices lowered as they passed. Noah was already there, seated in the same place, but the arrangement around him had shifted again. The crackers were gone. In their place sat a small folded napkin, placed precisely at the center of the seat beside him, its edges aligned with the seam of the cushion. His backpack rested against his legs, unzipped a little wider than before, revealing a corner of paper inside, though he did not reach for it. Instead, his hands rested on either side of the seat, fingers spread lightly, as if marking space rather than holding anything. Lena narrowed her gaze slightly, tracking that detail, then lifted her eyes toward the column where Caleb had stood each night. He was not there yet. For a brief moment, the space felt incomplete, as if one piece of the arrangement had been delayed, and Lena found herself glancing once toward the corridor entrance before returning her focus to the boy. The double doors remained closed. The hallway held its quiet. Then Caleb appeared, not from the direction Lena expected, but from the far end near the service hallway, his steps unhurried, his posture the same as always, his presence folding into the space without announcement. He did not look toward Lena or anyone else. He moved directly to his usual distance from Noah, though he paused a fraction earlier than before, stopping just short of where he had stood the previous nights. The difference was small, measurable only by the space between the column and his shoulder, but it shifted the alignment again. Lena leaned forward slightly, her fingers pressing into the counter edge as she tracked the new positioning. Caleb did not adjust further. He simply remained there, his gaze angled loosely toward the corridor, his stance relaxed but consistent. The napkin on the seat remained untouched. Noah's fingers lifted once, hovering over it, then lowered again without contact. The air vent above shifted direction, causing the napkin's corner to lift and settle with a faint movement that drew Lena's attention for a brief second before she returned her focus to the arrangement. The double doors opened. Victoria stepped out, her movement as controlled as ever, though tonight her pace slowed almost immediately, not after passing Noah, but before reaching him. She stopped 2 steps away, her body angled slightly toward the chairs, her gaze lowering more distinctly than on previous nights, though still not fully meeting the boy's eyes. The pause held longer this time, long enough that one of the passing nurses slowed her walk, her attention briefly drawn to the stillness before she continued on. Lena did not move. Her gaze remained fixed, her breathing quiet, her attention narrowing to the timing of each motion. Victoria's hand lifted again, not to reach, but to adjust something at her wrist, the fabric of her sleeve, then paused mid-motion before completing the adjustment. The delay was subtle, but it stretched the moment just enough to make it noticeable. Noah's hand lifted then, not toward her, but toward the napkin, his fingers brushing its edge lightly before withdrawing again. Caleb shifted at that exact moment, not forward, not closer, but turning his body a few degrees so that his stance aligned more directly with the space between Noah and Victoria, though he still did not step into it. The movement drew a brief glance from a passing orderly, who slowed slightly, his eyes flicking between the 3 figures before continuing down the hall. The silence deepened for a few seconds, not empty, but held, as if the space itself were waiting for something to resolve. Lena felt that pause extend, her grip on the counter tightening just enough to register, her attention fixed on Caleb now, as if expecting him to complete the sequence she had been trying to understand. But he did not move further. He did not speak. He did not break the pattern. Instead, he reached into his pocket slowly, not hurried, not hesitant, and pulled out a small object, something flat, something that fit easily in his palm. He held it there for a second, not offering it, not displaying it, just holding it at his side. Lena leaned forward another inch, her eyes narrowing to catch the detail. But before she could fully identify it, Caleb slid the object back into his pocket without using it, without changing his stance, without altering the space between them. The moment passed without resolution. Victoria resumed her movement, stepping past Noah with that same controlled pace, though her gaze lingered a fraction longer this time before lifting again. She continued down the hallway toward the elevators, her posture returning to its usual precision. Noah's hand lowered back to the seat. The napkin remained in place. Caleb remained where he stood, his presence unchanged, his actions contained within the same quiet rhythm he had maintained all along. Lena stayed where she was, her eyes still on him, the question now more defined than before, not about what he was doing, but about why each small action seemed to stop just short of completion, leaving the pattern intact but unresolved, and instead of stepping away, she held her position, waiting for the next detail to reveal itself. The hallway held that same suspended quiet, but it stretched longer this time, as if even the background noise had lowered itself to make room for something not yet visible, and Lena found her attention narrowing without effort, her body still angled at the counter, but her weight shifting subtly onto one foot. Her gaze fixed not on the boy now, not on the CEO moving toward the elevators, but on Caleb, as if the question had finally settled there. He had not moved since slipping the object back into his pocket, his stance steady, his distance unchanged, and for a moment it seemed the pattern would repeat again without resolution. Then a soft chime broke from inside the ICU room, not urgent, not alarming, just a short, irregular tone that lingered a second longer than the others. Noah reacted first, though not dramatically. His shoulders tightened slightly, his head turning toward the closed doors, his hand lifting halfway before stopping in midair, fingers hovering without direction. Victoria, already a few steps down the corridor, slowed but did not turn back immediately. The pause was there again, but it carried something different this time, less precise, less controlled. Lena noticed that hesitation, her eyes tracking the small shift in rhythm, then returning to Caleb just as he moved. It was not a rush, not a break in his usual pace. He stepped forward once, closing the space between himself and the chairs by a foot, then angled slightly toward the wall-mounted emergency panel beside Noah, the one with the row of colored buttons and a small instruction plate that most visitors passed without reading. He did not look at Noah directly. Instead, he reached up and pressed a small adhesive strip onto the panel, something he had already pulled from his pocket in one smooth motion. It was a narrow piece of tape, bright blue against the neutral surface, placed precisely beneath one of the buttons. The motion took less than 2 seconds. Then, just as calmly, he picked up the folded napkin from the chair, unfolded it once, and with a pen that seemed to appear from his other hand, he wrote 3 words in large, clear block letters. He did not hesitate. He did not pause to check the spacing. The strokes were quick, practiced. He refolded the napkin, but not tightly, leaving it open enough for the words to remain visible, then set it back on the seat in front of Noah, not pushing it toward him, not handing it over, just placing it within reach. The words faced outward, aligned with the boy's line of sight. Press blue button. Stay here. That was all. No explanation. No gesture to accompany it. Caleb stepped back immediately after, returning to his previous distance, his posture resetting as if the movement had never happened. Lena felt her hand tighten slightly against the counter edge, her eyes flicking from the taped marker to the napkin, then to Noah. The boy's gaze had already shifted, not toward Caleb, but toward the panel. His eyes tracked the blue strip, holding there for a second, then dropped to the napkin, reading without touching it. His hand lifted again, this time with direction, hovering briefly before lowering to rest against the edge of the chair instead. He did not press the button. Not yet. But the hesitation looked different now, less uncertain, more contained. The sound from the ICU room came again, slightly sharper this time, and Victoria turned back fully, her steps slowing to a stop as she looked toward the doors. She did not move toward Noah immediately. Instead, her gaze passed over him, then toward the panel, just for a fraction of a second before returning to the doors. Lena caught that glance. It was small, almost unnoticeable, but it landed differently now that the marker was there, now that the instruction sat visible in the boy's space. A nurse at the far end of the hall paused mid-step, her attention drawn briefly toward the sound, then toward the cluster of stillness around the chairs, her movement slowing before resuming again. The air felt denser for a moment, not tense, but focused, as if the space itself had narrowed around that small, deliberate change. Caleb remained still, his eyes no longer shifting, his presence quiet again, but the effect of the action lingered. Lena adjusted her stance, stepping a fraction closer to the counter without realizing it, her gaze moving between the panel, the napkin, and the boy, the earlier pattern no longer holding in the same way. The pieces were still there, the distance, the silence, the lack of direct contact, but something within it had shifted, not louder, not clearer, just enough to suggest that what she had been watching was not absence, not indifference, but something structured, something placed with intention, and for the first time, she did not feel like she was waiting for the pattern to complete itself. She felt like she had just missed the moment it began to make sense. The second tone from the ICU did not escalate, but it changed just enough to shift the way the hallway held itself, a sharper interval, a shorter gap between signals, and Lena saw the difference in how the staff moved before anything else happened. One nurse turning her head sooner, another adjusting her path mid-step, their attention tightening toward the doors. Noah reacted differently this time. His hand did not hover without direction. It lifted and held for less than a second, then moved straight to the panel, his fingers pressing the blue-marked button with a firm, single motion. The sound that followed was immediate, a distinct call tone layered over the previous signal, clearer, more specific. Within seconds, the response changed. The nurse who had been walking down the hall turned fully now, her pace quickening, another appearing from the opposite side, both moving with purpose but without panic, their attention fixed on the panel and the door rather than scanning the corridor. Lena felt her posture shift without realizing it, her shoulders straightening, her grip on the counter loosening as her gaze followed the sequence, from the button, to the nurses, to the door opening again with a sharper push. The movement inside the ICU became visible only in fragments, a figure stepping aside, a monitor repositioned, hands moving with practiced coordination, but the hallway itself remained controlled, no raised voices, no urgency spilling outward. Noah stepped back from the panel after pressing the button, not retreating far, just enough to clear the space, his hands lowering to his sides, his body still but not frozen. The napkin remained on the chair, the words visible, unchanged. Caleb did not move toward him. He did not step in. He remained at the same distance, his posture steady, his presence unbroken, as if the action had already completed its purpose. Victoria had stopped completely now, her body angled toward the door, her gaze fixed on the opening as the staff moved inside. She did not rush forward. She did not call out. But her position shifted, one foot stepping slightly closer, her shoulders no longer aligned with the corridor, but turned toward the room, her focus no longer divided. Lena noticed that detail, the way her stance had changed from movement to placement, from passing through to staying. The hallway adjusted around it. The nurse who had slowed earlier now paused near the station, her eyes briefly flicking toward Noah before returning to the ICU door, her presence no longer drifting but anchored. The faint hum of the overhead lights seemed quieter, the distant sounds receding as the immediate space sharpened. Lena's gaze moved back to the panel, the blue strip still in place, then to the napkin, then to Noah, and something in the sequence settled into alignment. The earlier moments, the bottle appearing without exchange, the crackers placed within reach, the napkin positioned but not handed over, the distance always maintained, the pauses never broken, all of it held the same structure. Nothing had been given directly. Nothing had been forced. Each piece had been placed where the boy could reach it, see it, choose it. Even now, no one had told him what to do. He had read the instruction, seen the marker, and acted on his own. The result was immediate, visible, functional. The system responded correctly. The staff moved efficiently. The situation inside the room was addressed without confusion. Lena felt her attention shift again, not searching for the next inconsistency, but reordering what she had already seen. Caleb's earlier movements no longer felt incomplete. They felt precise. The distance was not avoidance. It was consistency. The lack of direct contact was not absence. It was control of space. Victoria's pauses, her slight shifts, the way she had not reached out, not intervened, not broken the sequence, all of it aligned differently now. She had not stepped in when Noah hesitated. She had allowed the moment to hold. She had looked toward the panel, not the boy, just long enough to acknowledge the option placed there. Lena adjusted her stance again, stepping slightly away from the counter this time, her body no longer leaning forward but standing more upright, her gaze widening to take in the full arrangement rather than isolating each detail. The nurses continued their work inside the room, the door partially open, their movements steady and contained. Noah remained where he was, his posture relaxed now, his hands no longer hovering but resting naturally at his sides. Caleb stayed in place, his presence quiet, unchanged, as if the sequence required nothing more from him. Victoria took one more step toward the door, then stopped again, her attention fixed inside, her posture held in that same controlled stillness. The hallway settled into a new rhythm, not returning to its earlier flow, but not escalating either, simply holding the shape created by that single, small action, and in that held space, Lena no longer saw a gap between what had been happening and what it meant. She saw a pattern that had been working all along, one that did not rely on urgency or intervention, but on something placed carefully, repeated consistently, and allowed to unfold without being taken over. The hallway did not return to its earlier rhythm right away, but it softened, the sharper edge of attention easing as the nurses continued their work behind the partially open ICU door, their movements steady and contained, no longer drawing the same concentrated focus from those passing by. Lena did not lean forward this time. She let her hands rest loosely on the counter, her shoulders no longer angled toward a single point, her gaze moving more slowly between the panel, the chair, and the small space where Noah stood. The blue strip remained on the wall, simple and visible, no longer out of place. The napkin still lay open on the seat, its edges slightly shifted from where the boy had brushed it earlier, the words facing outward without needing to be read again. Noah had stepped back another inch, enough to settle into the space without crowding it, his posture easier now, his hands no longer hovering or marking the edges of objects, just resting naturally at his sides before one lifted briefly to adjust the strap of his backpack. He did not look toward Caleb. He did not look toward the panel again. He simply remained where he was, the earlier hesitation no longer present in the same way. Caleb had not moved either. He stood at that same measured distance, his stance unchanged, his presence quiet in a way that no longer drew Lena's attention as a question. It held as part of the arrangement now, something that did not need to be tracked moment by moment. A cart rolled past behind Lena, the soft rattle of its wheels returning to the background, a nurse speaking in a low voice to someone just out of sight, the normal sounds of the floor filling in the space again without pressing against it. Victoria remained near the ICU door, her posture still composed, but no longer aligned with departure. She stood facing the room, one hand resting lightly against her forearm, her gaze fixed inside. When one of the nurses stepped out briefly to adjust something on the wall, Victoria shifted slightly to the side, creating space without stepping away, her movement small but deliberate. Lena noticed that adjustment, the way it matched the earlier pattern of placement rather than interruption, and she did not move closer to observe it. She stayed where she was, her attention no longer searching for what was missing, but allowing the details to settle as they were. A few moments later, the nurse returned inside, the door easing closer to its frame, leaving only a narrow gap. Noah glanced toward it once, a brief, quiet look, then lowered his gaze again, his fingers brushing the edge of the chair before letting go. The napkin remained untouched. The blue marker remained in place. Caleb shifted his weight slightly, not changing his position, just adjusting his stance the way someone does after standing for a while, his movement blending into the background rather than standing out against it. Lena's eyes followed the motion for a second, then moved away without holding. She reached for her clipboard, not to check anything specific, just to reposition it on the counter, her fingers sliding it an inch to the side before letting it rest. The act was small, ordinary, but it marked a change in how she occupied the space. She was no longer standing there to catch something unusual. The hallway resumed its flow around them, staff moving past without slowing, the elevator chiming at the end of the corridor, doors opening and closing in a steady rhythm. Victoria remained where she was, her focus unchanged, but the earlier pauses no longer felt like interruptions. They read as part of the same pattern Lena had seen take shape, a way of staying without stepping in, of holding position without closing distance. Noah remained near the chair, not reaching for anything, not waiting for anything to be handed to him. The objects around him stayed where they had been placed, available, visible, but not imposed. Lena let her gaze rest on the blue strip one more time, then shifted it back to the corridor, her posture easing as she stepped slightly away from the counter, not leaving, just no longer anchored to that exact spot. The space no longer felt like something she needed to solve. It held its shape on its own, the earlier tension settling into something quieter, something that did not resolve completely, but no longer asked to be understood all at once. The hallway settled fully into its usual rhythm, the earlier focus dissolving into the steady flow of footsteps, quiet conversations, and the soft mechanical sounds that filled the space without drawing attention. Lena no longer held her position at the counter. She stepped back, not abruptly, just enough to change her angle, her body turning slightly toward the rest of the floor instead of remaining fixed on the chairs. Her gaze still passed over the scene, but it did not linger the same way. It moved, paused briefly, then moved on again, as if the need to track every detail had loosened on its own. Noah remained near the chair, shifting his weight once as he reached down to adjust the zipper of his backpack, pulling it closed with a small, careful motion before letting his hand rest on top of it. The napkin stayed where it had been placed, its edges no longer perfectly aligned, one corner slightly bent from where his fingers had brushed it earlier. The blue strip on the panel remained unchanged, bright against the neutral surface, no longer standing out as something new, just part of the wall now. Caleb adjusted his stance again, a small shift of his shoulders as he turned slightly toward the corridor, his presence blending into the movement around him as a nurse passed by without slowing, her attention on a chart in her hand. He did not look toward Noah. He did not check the panel. He simply remained, then after a moment, took a slow step back toward the column, returning to a position that made him less central, less defined within the frame. Victoria stepped away from the ICU door as the nurse inside gave a brief nod, her movement controlled, her posture returning to its earlier alignment, though she did not resume walking immediately. She paused near Noah, not directly in front of him, but close enough that the space between them narrowed for a second. Her hand moved slightly, not reaching out, just adjusting the strap of her bag on her shoulder before lowering again. Noah looked up briefly, his gaze passing over her without urgency, then dropping back down as he shifted the backpack strap into a more comfortable position. Victoria continued on, her steps measured, the sound of her heels soft against the floor as she moved toward the elevator. The doors opened with a quiet chime, and she stepped inside without looking back. Lena watched that moment, not with the same sharp focus as before, but with a softer attention, her posture relaxed, her weight evenly balanced as she stood a few feet away from where she had been earlier. She picked up her clipboard, glancing down at it for the first time in several minutes, then turned slightly as another nurse approached, exchanging a brief nod before stepping aside to let her pass. The hallway continued, unchanged on the surface, but the arrangement she had been watching no longer felt incomplete. It did not call for her attention in the same way. As she moved to return to her station, her gaze passed once more over the chair, the napkin, and the panel, the small details holding their place without needing to be followed. She did not stop this time. She did not wait for another moment to confirm anything. She simply let the scene remain as it was and continued on, her steps steady, her attention returning to the rest of the floor. If something in that quiet exchange stayed with you, share your thoughts and follow along for more. Thank you for being